ChatGPT Gnoi. Great, I'll begin the rewritten part 1 now. Rewritten script part 1, 700 to 900 words. Cinematic, natural, YouTube long-form tone. Same pacing and emotional gravity. Compressed but fully faithful. Ash Hollow, Wyoming Territory. December 1884. The wind screamed across the plains like something wounded, tearing between the crooked buildings of the tiny frontier town. Snow didn't fall so much as it attacked, blowing sideways and cold, punishing sheets that buried the muddy ground beneath hard white drifts. Morning light tried to break through the cloud cover but failed. The sky sat heavy and gray, like a slab of lead hanging over the world. At the edge of what passed for an open-air market in winter, a butcher hunched over the carcass of a freshly hunted deer. Steam rose from the blood against the snow while his knife flashed in steady rhythm. A few townsfolk exchanged goods quietly, shoulders drawn in, breaths turning white. Their murmurs were swallowed by the wind. Just beyond the path, where footprints vanished almost as soon as they were made, a woman stood frozen in place like a frostbitten tree. Her coat was wool, patched until color and shape barely held together, and far too thin for weather like this. She pulled it close around her shoulders, but it did little. In one arm she carried a baby swaddled deep in a shawl. For more children, pressed close at her legs, too cold to cry, too hungry to complain. Their faces were pale, their noses red, and their eyes carried the hollow look of hunger that no longer whined, only waited. Her name was Lillian Harper, 32, once the wife of a carpenter back in Missouri. Now she was simply another shadow struggling westward. She and the children had walked 3 days through snow to reach Ash Hollow, carrying nothing except what they could strap onto their backs. She did not step forward. She did not beg. She simply stood there, the cold turning her breath to thin strings of fog. When the butcher wiped his hands and moved to the next customer, Lillian whispered so soft the wind should have eaten the words whole. "We haven't eaten in days." The butcher didn't turn. Whether he didn't hear or chose not to, no one knew. A woman with a thick scarf tugged her own child aside. From down the saloon porch came a short laugh, sharp as a blade slicing through an already fragile moment. Lillian lowered her head. The weight of the day, the winter, the world pressing down like a millstone. She didn't see him at first. Across the small square, half hidden in the shadow of the blacksmith's forge, a man stood watching. His coat was dark, his hat pulled low. Everything about him seemed quiet, contained like a storm held behind ribs. Folks knew the name Wade Monroe, though few spoke to him. A ranch hand from Mustang Ridge, a former cavalryman, the type who didn't make noise unless noise was required. His eyes, when the light caught them, were the color of storm clouds about to break. Wade watched the scene without moving. Then, without warning or fanfare, he stepped forward. His boots creaked in the snow, the only sound he offered. He knelt so he wouldn't startle the children, unfastened his saddlebag and pulled out what little he had: a round of hard bread, a small wrapped piece of smoked meat, a tin of beans. One by one, he placed the food into small, trembling hands. The youngest nearly dropped her share from excitement, but Wade caught it and steadied her. He didn't smile, but something softened in the lines of his face, something quiet, almost like a promise. Lillian blinked, unable to form words. "Why would you?" But Wade didn't wait for questions. He didn't wait for thanks. He simply rose, adjusted his coat against the cold, and disappeared around the side of the forge like a shadow melting back into its rightful place. "Mama," one of the boys whispered, staring at the spot where the stranger vanished. "Who was that man?" Lillian clutched her baby a little tighter. "I don't know," she murmured. But her voice had changed, not full of hope, but not empty anymore either. More like someone remembering what a breath felt like after holding it for too long. Around them, the town carried on. The butcher kept cutting. Snow kept falling, wind kept howling, but for one mother and 5 starving children, a quiet stranger, but had pushed the darkness back if only for a single day. The next morning, Ash Hollow stirred beneath a sky-tinted gray. The storm had passed, but the cold was a sharper beast now, biting through wool and skin without mercy. Wade Monroe was already awake, stabling his mare outside the feed store. He sipped black coffee from a battered tin cup, steam curling around the scar on his neck. Most people didn't know much about him, and Wade preferred it that way. Once, long ago, he had ridden with the Union cavalry. Folks said he returned from the war seeing too much and speaking too little. Now he worked alone on Mustang Ridge, breaking wild horses paid in hay, shelter, and silence. He lived in the loft of the ranch barn, ate simple meals, spoke rarely, whittled little wooden birds by the riverbank when he needed quiet, which was often. That morning, he noticed Lillian crossing Main Street with her 5 children, stopping outside the boarding house. Mrs. Kelty, the owner, stood with arms crossed, jaw tight. "I heard you might have a room," Lillian said, voice steady despite her shaking hands. "Too many children," Mrs. Kelty replied. "This ain't a charity. I can pay soon. I'll find work." "You'll want the mission out east," the woman said, "or the old chapel. Floors are cold, but they're free." Wade set his tin cup down. Slowly, he walked across the street. He didn't greet Lillian. He didn't look at her. He simply placed an envelope on the boarding house table. "She stays," he rasped. "That covers a month." Mrs. Kelty stared. You're vouching for her? I am. Then he walked away, coat brushing the wind. By noon, the whole town was buzzing with whispers, and by evening, Wade was already heading north back toward Mustang Ridge. Back into the quiet, carrying an unfinished wooden bird in his pocket like something he wasn't ready to explain. 3 days passed before the first rumor turned into truth. By then, the excitement in Ash Hollow had faded into winter routine. Life in a frontier town rarely held on to surprises for long. But news traveled fast when a widow with 5 children appeared on Mrs. Kelty's porch with her belongings suddenly piled outside the door. Lillian stood stiffly in the street, trying to keep the cold from biting through the thin coats wrapped around her children. Mrs. Kelty didn't offer an apology, only a tired sigh. I warned you, she said. 5 children are too much noise for a house meant for quiet guests. It's not personal. Lillian didn't argue. She rarely did. She gathered their few belongings, adjusted the rusted cart they'd found near the livery, and gently herded her children west away from Main Street, away from the staring eyes, away from a place that had given shelter only briefly. They pushed through the falling snow until the town disappeared behind the trees. The trail grew thinner, mud frozen into ridges beneath the drifts. Finally, they reached a sagging cabin half swallowed by pine and shadow. Its roof leaned tiredly to the left. A torn flour sack flapped where a windowpane should have been. One step cracked underfoot. It wasn't much, but it had 4 walls. And tonight, that was enough. That inside the cabin smelled of old dust and forgotten winters. The floorboards creaked under the children's boots. Lillian kindled a fire with damp wood scavenged from beneath the porch. Smoke billowed into the room before reluctantly drifting up the stone chimney. She seated the youngest close to the hearth and divided what little food remained from Wade's gift, half a crust of bread each, a few sips of water. They ate like it was a feast. That night, as darkness pressed against the cabin walls, Lillian sat awake. Every groan of the old wood sent her heart racing. Every hiss of wind through the cracks reminded her how fragile the shelter really was. She didn't know she was being watched, up on a snow-covered ridge. Wade Monroe sat astride his mare. From this height, the crumbling cabin was a faint shape in a world of white. He'd noticed someone taking shelter there, and something in his gut told him who. He didn't approach, he didn't call out. But when night deepened and the last light flickered weakly behind that torn curtain, he rode down the slope, letting the wind cover the sound of his hooves. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He simply worked. He stuffed dry straw beneath the cabin to block the worst of the drafts, hammered the loose doorframe back into place with the side of a hatchet, reinforced the broken step with an old board he carried for repairs on the ranch, and when he finished, he left a sack at the door quietly, like a ghost passing through. In it, a dozen potatoes, 3 turnips, a wool blanket folded with currand. Then he was gone by dawn. Snow had erased every trace of him. Lillian found the bundle when she opened the door. Her eyes widened and she looked around, but the world was untouched. No footprints, no clues. Her eldest son held up the sack. It's not from town, he said. No one liked us there. Maybe the mission, she murmured. Maybe the church. She said it to soothe herself, but even she didn't believe it. The next night, another bundle came, then another, a polished hatchet, warm bread wrapped in oilcloth, cured meat tied tightly with twine, always left before sunrise, always appearing like a miracle on the threshold of a broken cabin. Lillian tried to make sense of it. In the end, she told herself the story her heart needed. Someone out there still has a heart, she whispered, and that was enough. Until the day her youngest wandered too far. The storm had quieted a little that morning. The children gathered kindling while Lillian shook snow off a blanket outside. The smallest boy, Micah, chased something he thought he saw between the trees, a snow hare, maybe, or just a drifting shape of white. Micah, Lillian called, panic ripping through her. Come back. No answer. She ran barefoot into the snow, heart pounding, breath tearing her lungs, and then she heard a voice. Deep, steady, calm. He's safe. Lillian pushed through a thicket and stumbled into a clearing. There, kneeling in the snow, was the quiet stranger she had seen only once across a street. Wade Monroe. He held Micah gently, the child's tiny hands gripping the collar of his coat. Thank you, mister, the boy whispered, voice small and sincere. Wade froze. His breath caught not from cold, but from something deeper. He looked at Micah, then over the boy's shoulder to where Lillian stood, trembling with fear and relief. He didn't speak. He simply unwound the child's arms from his coat, stood, tipped his hat, and turned away. Snow settled on his shoulders as he walked off, footsteps already filling with white. That night, after the children fell asleep, Lillian found something pinned to the inside wall of the cabin drawn in charcoal, uneven and childlike. A tall man in a dark hat, a woman beside him, 5 children holding hands, all smiling beneath it, in clumsy letters. Man with sad eyes. He lives in our house now. Lillian touched the drawing with trembling fingers. For the first time since Missouri, she didn't feel entirely alone. The storm grew worse over the next few days, howling winds, hard flakes of snow that stung like sand when they hit exposed skin. But inside the leaning cabin by the pines, something had shifted. Hunger still lingered in the children's eyes. and cold still crept through the floorboards. Yet an invisible warmth had settled among them. It had begun the night they found the charcoal drawing. The tall man, the dark hat, the 5 children smiling next to him, the clumsy title, Man with Sad Eyes. Lillian didn't know what to make of it. Gratitude, hope, or the kind of wish-hungry children cast like pennies into a well. She touched the drawing for a moment longer, then quietly blew out the lantern. She didn't know that, just outside the cabin, Wade Monroe leaned against a pine trunk, watching the smoke curl from the chimney. The cold bit through his coat, but he stayed until the cabin lights went out. Only then did he slip back into the forest, the snow swallowing his tracks behind him. The repairs begin the next morning brought clearer skies and bitter cold. Wade returned, keeping a distance at first, his mare tied among the trees. He had brought nails, shingles, and a small toolkit borrowed from the ranch. The cabin roof sagged dangerously under the weight of fresh snow. Wind rushed through cracks big enough to slip fingers through. He didn't knock. He didn't ask permission. He climbed the cabin ladder and started repairing the roof. Inside, Lillian paused mid-cook when she heard the hammering. For a moment her heart seized with fear. Was it the men who had turned her husband's debts into nightmares? But when she stepped outside, she saw Wade on the roof, quiet as the sky itself, passing nails to her eldest son, Nathan. Nathan looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. Wade didn't speak much. He rarely did, but he showed the boy how to hold the hammer, how to drive a nail straight without splitting the wood. Nathan watched every movement like he was learning the language of steady hands for the first time. After a long stretch of silence, the boy finally asked, "You ever have a son, Mr. Wade?" Wade paused, his breath fogged in front of him. Snow clung to the edge of his hat. "No," he said softly. Then, after a beat, "But there was one." Nathan didn't move. The hammer rested in his small hand. "Forgotten." Wade inhaled slowly, the cold turning the air sharp in his lungs. "A long time ago I rode with the cavalry," he said. His voice had an edge, ragged from memory and the scar on his throat. "We were sent into Cheyenne country, told to burn what we found. No prisoners, just fire." Nathan's eyes widened. Wade stared out toward the tree line as if watching the past unfold. There was a boy, maybe 7, stood in the middle of all that smoke and screaming. Didn't run, didn't cry. He looked down at his hands, scarred, rough, calloused, hands that once held a rifle, now repairing a roof for strangers. "I dropped my gun," he whispered, picked him up, ran into the woods, snow up to my knees. No coat for him except mine. Wind whistled between the trees. Nathan didn't speak. "I tried to keep him warm," Wade continued. "Built a fire with my last match, but the wind was too strong." A long silence stretched between man and boy. "He didn't make it through the night," Wade said quietly. "I buried him under a birch tree, carved a name into the bark. Didn't know if it was right. Didn't know anything except I couldn't go back." He steadied the shingle beneath his hand. "That's the day I stopped being a soldier. Maybe not on paper, but here." He tapped his chest. "A man can carry a uniform long after he stops carrying a reason." Nathan swallowed. He didn't understand the whole story, but he understood enough. Wade picked up another nail, pressed it into the cold wood, and said with a softer voice, "That's why I don't carry a rifle anymore. Not because I fear killing, but because I once held something worth saving." He handed Nathan a fresh board. "Let's fix this crack," he said. "Winter's not done with us yet." And together, they kept working. The storm arrives, but winter had just begun to show its teeth. By mid, the sky darkened like molten iron. The wind rose, howling across the hills with a force that rattled the cabin walls. Snow fell in thick sheets so dense the world beyond the clearing vanished. Pine branches groaned, roofs bowed. It was the kind of storm even seasoned ranchers whispered about later in the saloon. Inside the cabin, Lillian moved quickly, stuffing rags beneath the door, huddling her children together near the hearth, rationing what remained of the potatoes and bread. The fire sputtered weakly, swallowing damp logs reluctantly. That night her youngest cried softly from hunger. The others didn't. They were used to hunger now. By dawn the last crumbs were gone. Lillian sat by the hearth with an empty pot in her lap, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. She didn't pray. She hadn't prayed since her husband died. But she murmured to the embers, "Lord, give me strength to keep them alive one more day." Outside, the storm raged merciless and wide, and miles away, through that deadly cold, one man was moving. The storm swallowed the plains whole. Wind screamed across the open country like a living creature, tearing at anything unlucky enough to stand in its path. Snow fell so heavily it blurred the line between earth and sky, turning the world into a shifting, suffocating white. Ranchers hunkered down, praying their roofs held. Livestock was lost. Trails vanished, and still, one man pushed forward through the storm. Wade Monroe had left Mustang Ridge hours before dawn, riding toward Connolly's supply post 30 miles west because he knew what hunger looked like, and he knew what it sounded like when it came from a child. Mustang Ridge had nothing left to spare. Winter had bitten hard, so Wade rode on, praying Connolly's might have a handful of flour, maybe a tin of beans, anything by the time he arrived. His mare was trembling beneath him, flanks covered in frost. He tied her to the post, stumbled through the frozen door, and found Connolly staring at the few scraps left on his shelves. "We're shut," the storekeep said, rubbing his hands. "What's left ain't for sale." Wade didn't argue. He simply reached into his coat and placed everything he owned on the counter: a small wad of worn bills, a pocket watch smoothed by years of touch, and a carved cedar bird with unfinished wings. Connolly's brows lifted. "Important to you?" Wade's voice came low, rough. "They are now." 10 minutes later, he walked back into the storm with a sack tied behind his saddle. One sack of flour, a tin of beans, a single stale biscuit. Barely enough for one family for 2 days. But it was everything. The long ride. Back the wind lashed at Wade as he rode. Snow piled higher by the hour. Every gust felt like broken glass scraping his face. He spoke to his mare gently, urging her forward. "Almost there, girl." But the storm didn't care about promises. Halfway home, the mare faltered. Her legs shuddered beneath the weight of ice and exhaustion. Wade dismounted, pulling on her reins, begging her to keep going. Come on, girl." But she collapsed into the snow with a whimper too weak to stand. Wade knelt beside her, hand resting on her shivering neck. The pain in his voice was barely audible beneath the storm. "Rest, I'll come back for you." He untied the sack, hoisted it onto his back, and started walking. Every step disappeared behind him. The world was white. His breath came in ragged gasps. The cold gnawed at his bones. Snow climbed to his thighs. His vision blurred. Then crack. The ground split beneath his boots, a hidden ravine. Ice collapsed. Wade plunged down, striking stone with a force that stole the breath from his lungs. Pain roared through his side. He gritted his teeth hard enough to taste blood. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he did, because there were 6 people waiting for him in a cabin that barely held its shape in the storm. He dragged himself up, fingers tearing against sharp ice. He crawled out of the ravine, forced his legs to work, pulled the sack tighter to his chest and kept going. Hours slipped by like slow, brutal minutes. This storm didn't ease. His boots grew heavy with ice. His coat froze stiff. His lips cracked from cold. But then, through the white haze, a shape emerged. That cabin, soft as a ghost, its outline flickered through the storm. Wade's knees buckled once, twice, but he crawled the final distance across the clearing and collapsed against the porch, one hand still gripping the sack like it was a lifeline. His last conscious breath was a whisper. "Please, let them live." The moment everything changed inside, Lillian sat by the dying fire, rocking the empty pot in her hands, trying to think through the hunger. Then she heard it, a dull, heavy thud against the porch. Her heart lurched. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and cracked the door open, expecting wind, or fallen branches, or Wade Monroe, collapsed against the frame, snow crusted on his lashes, coat soaked through with sweat and melting ice, skin pale as ash, breath shallow and shaking. One hand clutched the sack of flour, the other pressed something beneath his coat. "Wade," she whispered, dropping to her knees. Her hands fumbled at his coat, dragging him inside inch by inch. The children rushed behind her, wide-eyed and silent. As she opened his coat, something slipped out and fell to the floor, a folded scrap of charcoal, smudged paper. Lillian picked it up. Her daughter's drawing, the tall man in the dark hat, the woman, 5 children, all smiling. Wade had carried it against his heart through a blizzard. Lillian's breath trembled. He wasn't helping them out of duty. He wasn't doing it out of pity. Something deeper lived beneath that coat, beneath that scar, beneath that quiet. She pressed a cool cloth to his burning forehead. "You're not dying in this house," she whispered fiercely. "Not after everything. Not today." Wade stirred, fevered, drifting. "Micah, stay warm, don't fall asleep yet." He thought he was still carrying the boy through the blizzard of his past. Lillian placed a hand on his chest, voice breaking. "You saved us, Wade. Now let us save you." The storm finally broke, but the cold still clung to the world like a warning. Snow lay in thick drifts around the cabin, piled so high it reached halfway up the walls. The wind no longer howled, it whispered, low and tired, like a beast worn out after a night of rage. Inside, the cabin glowed with a fragile warmth. Wade Monroe lay near the hearth, wrapped in layers of blankets, his breath shallow but steady. Fever had burned through him hard. For 2 days he drifted in and out, murmuring broken fragments of memories, sometimes calling names no one recognized, sometimes whispering to ghosts only he could see. Lillian stayed by his side. She barely slept, taking short rests with her hand still resting on his chest, counting each rise and fall like a prayer. She boiled water, cooled cloths, spooned broth between his cracked lips when he could swallow. Every movement was careful, gentle, steady, determined. The children had grown quiet in Wade's presence, but not afraid. They moved around him with soft steps, whispering instead of speaking, as though they understood something sacred was happening in their one-room cabin. They knew this man had given everything for them. They could feel it, even if they didn't yet have words for it. That second night, after the children dozed off in a huddled cluster near the fire, Lillian stayed awake, her hands folded in her lap. The flames painted shifting shadows across the walls, turning the old cabin into a church built of pine and silence. She watched Wade breathe, watched heat return little by little to his face, watched the scar on his throat catch the firelight like a silver thread. Something tightened in her chest, fear, gratitude, something gentler she didn't quite dare to name. She hadn't prayed since the day Thomas died. Not once the world had felt too cruel for prayers. But that night, her lips parted. Lord, she whispered softly, hesitant, almost unsure how to shape the words. I know I'm not one to ask. Not anymore. Her voice trembled. But if there is any grace left in this world, if there's any justice at all, let this man live. She brushed a strand of damp hair from Wade's forehead, her fingers lingering a moment longer than needed. He's given more than most ever will, she whispered, and he never once asked for anything back. The cabin held its breath with her. Then, from the corner near the fire, a tiny voice broke through. Lillian turned sharply. Her youngest daughter was talking in her sleep, curled up with the little wooden bird Wade had carved days earlier, clutching it to her chest like a treasure. Don't go, the girl murmured softly. Lillian's eyes filled. She wiped them away quickly, smiling through the ache in her throat. They've already decided, she whispered to the still room. They've already made their choice. The morning Wade woke. Dawn crept into the cabin in soft golds. Light filtered through the torn flour sack window, settling over Wade's face. He stirred. Lillian leaned forward, breath catching as his eyelids fluttered. He blinked, unfocused at first, unsure where he was. His gaze drifted to the ceiling beams, the fire, the children sleeping in a pile on the floor, then finally to her. How long? He rasped, voice cracked from fever and the scar that always made speaking painful. 3 days, she said softly. You were burning up. He tried to nod, then tried to sit up, but when he swung his legs off the bedroll, the world tilted violently. He stumbled, and Lillian caught him quickly, hands firm against his chest. Wade, stop, she said. Steadier now. Please, take it slow. I can't stay, he murmured, trying again to push himself upright. I should go. A grip on him tightened. Wade, she said quietly, you don't have to keep saving us. He froze. She lifted her gaze to his face, soft, earnest, trembling with something more than fear. You already did. Her hand remained on his chest, the warmth of her palm sinking deep into him. We don't need a hero anymore, she whispered. We just need you. Wade inhaled sharply, as if the words themselves hurt. I don't know how to stay, he admitted so softly she almost didn't hear it. It was the most vulnerable thing he'd ever said. You don't have to know, she replied. You just have to want to. He looked toward the window. Snow clung to the sill. Outside was the world he'd always known, cold and empty and wide. Inside, warmth flickered. Laughter murmured. A woman waited with steady hands. Lillian reached for his hand again, fingers barely brushing his stay. Wade hesitated, breath caught halfway between refusal and surrender. Then, slowly, he lowered himself back onto the bed. The tension in his jaw loosened. He looked at the fire, then back at her, and for the first time in years, maybe since before the war, Wade Monroe smiled. Not a polite nod, not a forced lift of the lips, but something real, something that came from deep, quiet places. It wasn't a promise. Not yet, but it was the beginning of one. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the land. Snow melted in uneven patches, revealing frozen mud and stubborn roots beneath. The trees shook off their icy coats. Birds returned to the branches. For the first time in months, the children dared to play a little farther from the cabin, rolling lopsided snowballs, chasing each other between the pines, shouting with laughter that felt brighter than the thin spring sun. For a moment, the world seemed to breathe again, and for a moment, Lillian allowed herself to believe the worst was behind them. But the past, it has a way of following tracks even snow cannot hide. The riders, they came at sunset. 3 riders cutting across the edge of Ash Hollow like wolves catching the scent of old blood. Their horses were lean, trained to run fast and long. The men atop them looked carved from cruelty, coats whipping behind them, pistols worn from use, eyes stripped of softness. One had a broken tooth that showed whenever he spoke. One had a long scar slicing his lip in two, and the last, tall, thin, mean as a rattlesnake, had a viper tattoo coiled around his neck. They tied their horses outside the saloon and walked inside like they owned the place. The room went quiet. Regulars lowered their eyes to their drinks. No one wanted to be noticed. No one wanted to be remembered. The tall man leaned on the counter, rapping his knuckles once. We're looking for someone, he drawled, voice thick with poison. Woman, 5 kids. Name's Lillian. Used to go by Harper. The barkeep froze. The tall rider spat on the floorboards and smiled a cold smile. Her man owed us more than he had. Thought he could run. He shrugged. He ran out of luck, just like she will. No one spoke, but someone whispered. Someone always did by the time the riders left the saloon. Their horses were already restless, snorting, pawing at the dirt, hungry for a hunt. The hunt began at dusk. Fear at the cabin. Lillian was just finishing supper, a thin stew, stretched from the last scraps Wade had managed to bring home. The children were helping gather wood. Wade was outside splitting logs, still not fully healed but too stubborn to rest. That was when they heard it. Hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate, approaching through the trees like the sound of a door. closing. Lillian stepped onto the porch, apron still tied. Her children felt it, fear settling in their throats before they even saw the riders. 3 silhouettes emerged from the trees, blocking the last rays of sun. Well, the viper-necked rider called, sliding off his horse. Ain't this a picture? Little house. Big mistake. Lillian moved in front of the doorway, shielding her children with her body. I have nothing, she said firmly. My husband is dead. There's no debt left to collect. That's where you're wrong. The scar-lipped one chuckled. Unfinished business don't disappear when someone dies. The broken-tooth rider stepped forward, eyes sliding to the windows. You think just cause some ex-soldier's been hanging around, you're safe. Inside the cabin. One of the children whimpered. And then the door behind Lillian opened. Wade steps forward. Wade Monroe stepped into the doorway barefoot, wearing his patched old coat. He wasn't fully healed, but he stood tall, quiet, steady, carved from resolve. His revolver hung at his hip, not for show, for necessity. He looked at the riders, then past them, then back again, his eyes cold as the winter he'd survived. The viper-necked man squinted. I know you, he sneered. You're that one, the coward soldier. A slow smile crawled up his face. The man who walked out to Cheyenne country without firing a single shot. The one who let him live. He spat in the snow. They say you don't shoot. Not anymore. Wade's fingers brushed the handle of his revolver, not with eagerness, not with fear, but with the acceptance of a man opening an old wound. If you came here looking for that man, Wade said quietly, the one who walked away from killing, you picked the wrong day. He stepped off the porch. The riders stiffened. I buried that part of myself, Wade continued, voice low. But I'll dig it up if I have to. I don't want blood. His hand rested firmly on the gun, but I'll spill it to keep them safe. The viper-necked man drew first. He was fast, but Wade was faster. A single shot cracked across the clearing. Precise. Final. The tall rider dropped instantly, dead before he touched the ground. The other 2 froze. Wade's revolver stayed raised. His hand didn't tremble. Go, he said. They obeyed. Horses spun. Hooves thundered back through the trees, disappearing into dusk like ghosts chased by justice. Aftermath. Lillian exhaled shakily, realizing she had been holding her breath. The children clung to her skirts, trembling from the shock. Wade holstered the gun slowly, every movement heavy with something like sorrow. He walked inside, past Lillian, past the frightened children, and set the revolver on the table. Then he sank into the chair by the fire, bowed his head, and closed his eyes. He hadn't saved them with silence. This time he had saved them with the one thing he had sworn never to use again, and he knew he would carry that choice like a scar. The snow continued melting in slow, stubborn patches over the next days, retreating into the thirsty earth like a beast finally satisfied. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long golden beams across the cabin floor each morning. For the first time since winter began, the world outside felt less like an enemy. Inside, warmth wasn't just from the fire anymore. It lived in the air, in the laughter of the children, in the easy rhythm that had formed around Wade and Lillian, small routines that stitched themselves quietly into the cracks of their broken lives. A pot of soup simmered on the stove. Fresh bread cooled on the table, baked from the precious flour Wade had nearly died carrying home. Bootprints, mixed little and large, crossed the cabin floor, and for once the sound of children running didn't bring fear with it. Wade sat in the rocking chair near the hearth, turning a block of cedar in his scarred hands. He whittled slowly, gently, shavings falling like curls of pale snow at his feet. The cabin's glow softened the harsh angles of his face. His breath came easier. His eyes watched the children with a quiet fondness. He didn't bother hiding anymore. The shape of a bird was emerging from the woodwings, outstretched head tilted upward, caught mid-flight. It was rough in some places, smooth in others. The way Wade's hands moved over it, anyone could see he had carved that moment from memory. When he finished, he turned to the littlest girl sitting at his feet. "This is for you," he said softly. Her eyes lit as she took it with both hands, turning it this way and that, tracing every carved feather. "It looks like Pa," she said with a giggle. Wade blinked, startled by the tiny truth in her voice. Then he smiled gently. Quiet, steady. Lillian watched from across the room. She didn't speak. She just tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and felt something warm bloom in her chest. Something she had thought long dead. The cabin, once a place of fear and cold, now felt like a home. A letter home. Later that night, after the children were asleep in their makeshift beds beneath the loft, Lillian sat at the worn table. She smoothed out a sheet of parchment, dipped the quill carefully into ink, and began to write. "Dear Sarah," she began, her handwriting steady even though emotion tightened her throat. "I once told you this land would break a person before it ever gave anything back. I believed that for a long time." She paused, glancing toward the hearth where Wade sat, ankle crossed over knee, carving another small figure from a block of wood. Firelight glimmered against the scar at his neck, turning it silver. "But something changed," she continued. "We were nearly starved, frozen, forgotten, and then came a man, not with promises, not with gold, not with sermons, but with quiet hands and a stubborn heart." Her quill scratched softly across the parchment. He never asked for thanks, never asked to stay, but he did, and I have met the kindest man in a place where kindness should not survive. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept writing, and now, we are surviving too. She folded the letter, set it to dry, and turned toward the fire. A moment by the fire, the cabin was peaceful, glowing in the soft hush of night. The children's gentle breaths filled the room. Outside, the wind rustled lightly through the pines, no longer sharp or angry, just part of the world. No threat at all. No threat at all. Lillian walked to where Wade sat. He looked up at her as she approached his steady, the same color as a storm clearing. She sat beside him, closer than she ever had. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. The fire cracked softly, lighting the space between them with shifting amber. Finally, Lillian whispered, "The children won't go hungry again, will they?" Wade looked at her, his expression open, unguarded in a way she had never seen before. He let out a slow breath. "Not while I'm breathing," he said. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it carried more weight than any promise she'd ever been given. Her shoulders relaxed. For the first time in a long time, she believed a man's word. She believed his steadiness, his scars, his silence, all of it. She leaned her head slightly toward him. He didn't move away. They sat like that for a long time, to people who had once been strangers, now bound by something stronger than blood, something gentler than survival. They didn't need grand gestures or declarations. They had firelight, and warmth, and the quiet beginnings of a life shared. Outside, the last of the winter wind blew through the trees. Inside, hunger had been replaced by hope. And for the first time in years, Lillian Harper allowed herself to imagine a tomorrow that wasn't built on fear, a tomorrow built with him. Spring crept slowly into Ash Hollow, softening the edges of the harsh winter that had nearly claimed them. The last snow melted into thirsty earth, revealing patches of green and muddy trails where children now chased each other without fear. Birds returned to the pines. The world, for the first time in months, seemed to remember mercy. Inside the old cabin, life felt new, warmer, fuller. The fire crackled with a gentle confidence, no longer a desperate shield against winter, but a companion. Bread baked in the oven, soup simmered on the stove, laughter echoed through the rafters. The harsh season that had nearly broken them was now nothing more than a memory wrapped in gratitude. Wade Monroe had not left, not after healing, not after saving them, not after the riders rode off with fear in their bones. He stayed, not out of obligation, not out of pity, but because somewhere between hunger and hope, between silence and firelight, this cabin had become the only place that felt like home. A dinner that meant everything that evening. Sunlight spilled across the floorboards in long golden ribbons. The smell of fresh bread filled the room. Soup bubbled in a pot, thick with herbs and bits of tender meat. Lillian moved from hearth to table with practiced ease, her apron dusted with flour. The children helped set the tin bowls, jostling playfully for the biggest slice of bread. For once, she didn't have to stretch the ingredients so thin it broke her heart. For once the pot was full. Nathan poured water into cups while the youngest clapped along to an imaginary tune. Even the cabin itself seemed to glow, walls warmed by laughter instead of fear, windows reflecting something brighter than cold winter sky. Wade sat in the corner near the rocking chair, finishing another piece of carved cedar. His rough hands moved with tenderness, each stroke of the knife revealing more of the little wooden bird perched between his fingers. This one had wings fully extended. Caught in the moment just before flight, he turned it over once, twice, making sure the grain was smooth. Then he handed it gently to the littlest girl, who looked up at him as if he had given her a crown. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Wade smiled soft, shy, but sure. Lillian watched him across the room, something warm blooming in her chest all over again. The letter that marked a new beginning after the meal. When the children began to yawn and curl up beneath the loft in their blankets, Lillian sat at the table, staring at the folded letter she'd written to her sister. She added one more line. "Tell Mama. Tell her I have found something here I never thought I would again. Safety, hope, and maybe, in time, something even larger." She didn't write the word love. Not yet, but it lived between the lines. She set the letter aside to dry and walked toward the fire. When hearts finally speak, Wade was still sitting in the rocking chair, whittling another piece of cedar. His brow was relaxed. His eyes were soft. The firelight flickered over the scar on his throat, turning it silver and warm. Lillian stopped just beside him, while she whispered, folding her hands, "They won't go hungry again." Wade looked up at her slowly, the lines of his face gentling. "No," he said quietly. "Not while I'm breathing." The words sank into her like warmth after cold, steady, certain, undeniable. She lowered herself onto the bench beside him. For a moment, they simply watched the fire, the flames rising and falling like a heartbeat. "Wade," she said softly, "you saved us." He shook his head. "Just did what needed doing." "No," she turned toward him, her voice firmer now. "You gave my children back their laughter. You gave me back my hope." Her breath trembled. "You gave us life." Wade swallowed, eyes flicking from her to the fire and back again like a man deciding whether he deserved the warmth he'd found. Finally, he spoke. "You gave me something too," he said, "a place to belong." The cabin was silent. Even the fire seemed to listen. But Lillian reached for his hands more, brave, trembling, resting her fingers against his knuckles. He didn't pull away, for the first time. The space between them wasn't filled with fear, or hunger, or storms. It was filled with possibility. A new kind of sunrise the next morning dawned quiet and bright. The children raced outside to chase the early spring sun. Lillian stepped onto the porch with a shawl around her shoulders. Wade came up beside her, boots in his hands, not yet tied, hair tousled from sleep. For a long moment, they simply watched the children laughing in the clearing. "You staying?" she asked gently. Wade didn't look away from the children. "If you'll have me," Lillian's breath caught. "We already do," she whispered. He finally turned toward her, and this time, when he smiled, it wasn't small. It wasn't hesitant, it was real, full certain. They stood side by side, watching the world brighten around them. Not a promise carved into wood, not a vow spoken in ceremony, but something stronger. A man who once carried only sorrow now carried purpose. A woman who once feared the future now walked toward it with hope. 5 children who once knew only hunger now knew the steady, unwavering presence of someone who would never abandon them. In a world where mercy rarely survived, a family had been forged, quietly born from storms, carved from silence, held together by a man who stayed. Because sometimes the bravest thing a cowboy can do is remain.